From the urban scar of America's most traumatic moment in recent history to the windswept plains of Texas, the story of the United States' most symbolic relic of a bygone era is one of regeneration and rebirth over the centuries. The wooden skeleton has come to be known as the World Trade Center ship. Workers are digging in the mud that was once the Hudson River, now nearly a kilometer away from the waterfront, the site of the most outrageous act of terror in America's history. They are part of a massive urban regeneration project to bring life back to the World Trade Center Plaza. A wooden skeleton appears at the bottom of the pit. The ribbing and woodwork are painstakingly excavated at record speed, as construction cannot be held up in the city that never sleeps. What they find has come to represent the miraculously preserved roots of the world's greatest trading city, New York.
Every morning we went in, we walked by the fire station where all those guys had died. We walked right by their station and then into the site. It's touching. And everybody felt that. I mean, the workmen, the archaeologists, the press who came, everybody knew they were on hallowed ground.
7 years later, the story and the ship has moved far from New York, across the country to Texas. Another scorching day starts over the wooded southern plains. Here, students of the Texas A&M University at College Station work in one of the world's foremost marine archaeology and conservation centers. This is where the single most symbolic ship artifact in the history of the United States is being cured, conserved, and prepared for exhibition. Postgraduate student Meredith Stoops is preparing one of the timbers for scanning to create a scale model of the ship.
Even as you're working and it's a very monotonous routine, you kind of understand how significant the ship can be to others and where it was found. And I don't always keep that in mind, but then it comes back to you and you realize this is an important ship. Even if it was just a Hudson sloop, it's now quite important as to where it was found.
The bedrock of the World Trade Center was this ship that was ultimately preserved by this terrible destruction that happened in 2001.
All these little boats from all along the East Coast, the Caribbean, the Gulf Coast, much later on, the West Coast, they were the pickup trucks. They were the vehicles that people just used every day to put something here and then take it there.
Donnie Hamilton is the director of the Conservation Research Laboratory, one of the most advanced specialized laboratories in the world, founded more than 40 years ago. Peter Fix, archaeological conservator, manages nautical artifacts that come here. The timbers are at the center to be conserved and prepared for exhibition, and it is here where their deepest secrets will be revealed.
There's less than a third of the ship left, but we have enough historic data and other period ships and some ship plans that we can probably reasonably recreate it using these particular dimensions. Our ship modeler is pretty good at taking minimal remains and coming up with a fairly realistic representation of what it originally looked like.
There are about 400 large pieces and another 200 smaller pieces that had broken off and were or just associated. We received just an entire box of their only identification is found outside. So they could be part of the hull. We'll have to see if we can locate and find a home for them in the future.
Early morning, September the 11th, 2001. Two passenger aircraft crash into the World Trade Center towers, one after the other. A massive fire erupts as the full fuel tanks of the aircraft explode. The heat reaches thousands of degrees centigrade and begins warping the steel columns that hold the buildings up, as firemen rush to the scene and evacuate all those trapped in the lower floors for the next 55 minutes. Then, one by one, floor by floor, first one, then both buildings collapse, folding in on themselves and on top of the people still trapped inside. It is the most horrific terror attack against the United States ever, and brutally ends an era of unequaled peace and prosperity in world history. For the next 9 years, the United States and New York struggle with the impact of the attack. A new tower rises from the ashes. Two great cavities with waterfalls have been created where the Twin Towers once stood, and a single new skyscraper rises in their place, the One World Trade Center. The memorial flag in the adjacent square is permanently at half-mast, but the square is one of the city's tourist attractions. Warren Rees has returned here to see what has become of one of the most significant archaeological finds in American history, one that he helped excavate. Lying under this parking garage, just south of the South Tower, is the place where archaeologists found what has become known as the World Trade Center ship, one of the nation's most extraordinary discoveries, but also one of its least celebrated.
To me, the heavy construction of it, well, so were the towers, you know, but they're gone. Nothing we built is eternal.
During the slow process of repurposing the whole area, the archaeologists of engineering consultant firm AKRF are contracted by the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation to recover any artifacts of significance. Michael Papalardo, senior archaeologist at AKRF, coordinates the work on the ground.
Well, AKRF's initial involvement stretches back to the years after 9/11, as the City of New York planned the rebuilding process and reconstructing Lower Manhattan. One of the sites was south of the World Trade Center, that it was an area sensitive for the presence of the landfill retaining devices, the timber structures that were used as they built the city out westward into the Hudson River.
As the ancient timbers emerge from the mud, the archaeologists realize that what they have stumbled on is a mystery ship, a time capsule, inexplicably buried for centuries under the layers of New York. The find is potentially laden with significance. Mike Papalardo turns to America's leading ship archaeologist, Warren Rees.
The ship was sitting down about 20-some feet below the street level, and it was in the middle of a large area that was being excavated for the construction. So we were just south of the South Tower, what had been the South Tower of the World Trade Center. And we're looking at the bottom timbers of a ship, a small ship, and We had, it looked like about 50 feet of it at a quick glance. We had 5 minutes to look at it before we had to go to a planning meeting.
The ship, the condition of the wood was simply remarkable. The wood was buried beneath many, many feet of water-saturated silts and clays. And that environment is anaerobic, so there's the normal processes of breaking down organic matter weren't continuing. They had continued for some period of time before the ship was buried. So the portions of the ship that had a higher elevation than the river bottom had rotted away.
So the amazing archaeological adventure begins, with time ticking. The long working days end in the Irish pub nearby, where archaeologists marvel and reflect on the meaning of what they have found.
Day one.
Over 5 days, 2 teams work to extract the ship from the Manhattan mud. A team from New York, under the leadership of Michael Papalardo, and a team from Maine, directed by Warren Rees. After just a few days, they have an idea of what kind of ship it is and the symbolism of where it lay.
We were given a week and told us we could work as many hours as we could in 5 days, basically. And they gave us a week to get ready. So I brought in, besides the AKRF archaeology team, which was great, I brought in some ship specialists that it was students who'd work with me.
Although the work has to be done quickly, the team nevertheless takes every precaution to record the exact location of every artifact. The ship is a historical puzzle, and every clue is vital to decoding its secrets.
Because it had to happen so fast, everybody makes mistakes, but when you're moving that fast, I just figured we were going to make a lot of mistakes. So in archaeology, you have one shot. It's not like other sciences where you can redo the experiment. You take one layer, you record it, and you destroy it. So you got to do it right. And so normally we record things in about 3 different ways. We draw things, we measure things, we map things. And in addition to that, we used a laser, a 3-dimensional laser, recording every day of it at noontime. And then right after that, we had 3-dimensional spherical photography done on the site, so that whatever we missed one way, we'd pick up the other.
Some artifacts are the types of objects that are dumped in as disposing of garbage. There were many businesses in the area, and as the ships would bring goods off of the, would bring goods into the city, they'd be brought off the ship, and some would fall into the open water. So some of the artifacts were simply lying on the river bottom. Other artifacts were perhaps associated with the ship itself. You know, they are artifacts that were being stored in the ship or used by the people that operated the ship. And then other artifacts were in the fill that was used to raise the elevation of this area as the land was filled in.
I thought we had the bow because it was very rounded and the frames were what we call canted. So I thought we had the bow. As we proceeded down, though, it became obvious from some of the construction there, meaning that there was a stern post that came up, and there are things called gudgeons, which are like part of a hinge on the back of the vessel that the pintles from the rudder stick in so the rudder can move. And we started seeing, uh-oh, we've got the stern.
As the ship emerges from the debris and mud, more of its details become apparent. An odd item of wood raises many questions.
Another odd thing about the construction was the stern. Now, the stern is made up of a number of heavy timbers normally. This one, it was one piece, one 600-pound piece of oak that had been carved, beautifully carved, to function as what we call the stern knee that would be right at the end, and what's called the deadwood underneath, all one piece. Never seen that before.
It's a fabulous piece of wood. It's, I think, 11 feet long, about 2 feet wide, and what remains going up towards the transom is probably remains about 2.5, 3 feet. It weighs 500. We weighed it out. Currently, pre-conservation, it weighs 545 pounds. So it's a hefty piece of timber. So I mean, I don't know if anyone can specifically interpret an exact reason, but it is a wonderful piece of wood.
More yet emerges. There are signs the ship sailed as far as the Caribbean.
The other thing was that it obviously had Teredo shipworm all through the outer hull. Okay, that's not uncommon. What was uncommon was that it didn't have an outer sheathing to protect it, as if it wasn't made to go into warm salt water. And when we got the information back from Kevin Eckelbarger, who's with me at the University of Maine, that these were warm water species. And we, okay, so here's a vessel that's flat-bottomed, double-ended, big sloop, and it's going to the Caribbean, maybe Bermuda. It made sense.
The ship's hull is extraordinarily shallow in the water, another clue as to its category.
We got down to the keel at the very bottom of the vessel, and it was 4 to 6 inches. So here you have a sailing vessel that's 50 to 60 feet long, maybe 20 feet wide, with a keel that couldn't stop that vessel from going sideways in the wind. There are no centerboards. They didn't have centerboards yet at that point. So what was keeping this vessel from going sideways? Maybe a lee board, which would be a board on the side of the vessel that you drop down with, so kind of, and then you can pick it up. It's on a hinge. Normally you'd have 2, but some vessels had 1. But we didn't have the upper part of the vessel, so we couldn't tell if this one had lee boards or not.
Lee boards have been used for centuries in flat-bottomed boats, such as this Dutch sloop, seen in the Harlingen to Terschelling race. These boats, too, have rounded sterns. As the timbers are removed and mapped, certain construction characteristics begin to surprise the archaeologists, ones that will later be a source of concern for the conservators.
In the 18th century, almost every vessel, those planks and the outer planks are attached to the rest of the ship with wooden pegs called trunnels. It comes from the word tree nail. And this had 2 or 3 trunnels in the whole vessel. Everything was put together with iron nails. Very, very uncommon. In fact, quite rare. I'd never seen one in person because that was a very expensive way to make a vessel, and those ships had to go through storms. Well, if you have oak and pine and iron and it starts working, the iron's going to start cutting the wood around it.
Most of the ship was iron fastened. I believe there, I'd have to go look at the records, but I think there are 3 or 4 trunnels that were actually found. But the overwhelming majority of materials were iron. And that's very quick. And it looks, you can interpret some of the labor issues that are going on, the sociological issues that are going on. In fact, if they were doing that, then the product is becoming a lot cheaper than the labor itself.
Once the ship is entirely excavated, nearly 800 artifacts have been collected. Every detail of how they lay in their original position and their spatial relationship with the other pieces around them recorded. The archaeologists and scientists now begin working on the DNA of the ship. Dendrochronology, or tree ring dating, provides a vital clue. Amazingly, this science of dating the timbers shows that the World Trade Center ship was built from the same white oak woodland that was felled to build Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where the United States Declaration of Independence and Constitution were signed.
The FBI and Interpol have software that looks at fingerprints. So if you have someone you think might have done something, you take their fingerprints, and this software goes to everybody's data bank that signed in and compares it. So why don't we do that with dendrochronology, where everybody around the world who signs in makes their data available? We use that same software to do the comparison. And so when they looked at the samples from our vessel, they just put it out, and the software looked and found, oh, someone did that oak tree near Philadelphia, and it's a perfect match for your vessel. It was wonderful.
There were 3 layers of the ship: the inner series of planks, and then the outer layer of planks, and then a series of large structural timbers in between. And they created these small areas where sediments accumulated, and the artifacts in between those, they're called futtocks, between the futtocks were somewhat of a good context archaeologically. It's unlikely that they ended up there from the fill that happened afterwards.
The initial interest in the amazing find wanes as New Yorkers continue to live their busy lives in the financial and trading capital of the world. Little do they know, still today, that deep beneath their vertical city, in the bounds below the subway level, lie other ships. New York has been a trading city since the time of its founding by the Dutch as New Amsterdam in 1625.
I think the English would have probably called a hoy a work vessel. It's a small work vessel from 40 to 60 feet long as a hoy, and it can be a number of shapes. The Dutch would have called something like this, excuse my Dutch, but something like wildschip, which would be a double-ender sloop about that size, but that was an earlier kind of vessel. I think it's great in a way, because we don't know exactly what where it was from, what it was doing.
Back in the day, 100, 150, 200 years ago, everybody had a boat, just about, especially everybody in a seaport town, which is centripetal, not centrifugal. That's why you become so concentrated, because there's no room. Everybody wants to be by the ocean. You grow up on top of yourself. You grow up right by the water. And this ship, the World Trade Center ship, is indicative of that life.
New York was the trading pivot point for the whole of the Hudson River basin. Philadelphia craftsmen built this working boat that sailed down the whole American coast and traded as far inland as Albany. It was based in New York, a city located to take advantage of both access to the sea and major waterways.
So the city was extended outwards hundreds and hundreds of feet over time. It started off on the east side of Manhattan, and they would have to fill in, either fill in land or extend the docks further out into the deeper water. And that was the way the city was able to grow, was through establishing bulkheads and piers, and then enclosing them and filling that area in.
Especially right around the Federalist period in the United States, you have an initial boom, almost, is just before the Industrial Revolution, but you can look and trace with some research how things are progressing, and there's an awful large need to move product, to move commerce, and the rise of New York. New York was the pinnacle. I mean, it was the epicenter.
Urban regeneration is an ongoing process here. Buildings are put up and ripped down and rebuilt higher still, a process propelled by access to the Hudson River. The Hudson is a shallow, tidal river, treacherous for the inexperienced sailor. Here at Kingston, a group of volunteers are working on the upkeep of a replica of a Hudson River sloop, although of a later epoch.
So this is a sloop. Sloop is a single-masted sailing vessel. This sloop is a replication of sloops that would have sailed on the Hudson in the 18th and 19th century, carrying cargo from New York City to Albany and back up and down the river. So they are a peculiar design. Designed for sailing in the Hudson. Very large mainsail, tall mast to catch as much or as little rather wind there is in the river in the summer months. A wide boat, very stable with a shallow draft because the Hudson is muddy and fairly shallow in a lot of places.
The Hudson River sloop Clearwater is the brainchild of songwriter and activist Pete Seeger, as a way of bringing attention to the devastation of the Hudson River by heavy industry in the post-war era.
From New York City and further south, the sloops would have been carrying finished goods mostly up the river to the farms and communities upriver, and then on the way back down they would have been carrying kind of bulk goods, timber or large quantities of whatever to head to the factories in New York City and stuff. That was the general trend of the pattern of movement of goods up and down the river.
The Hudson River sloops played a key role in building New York. Here in one of New Amsterdam's first roads, Bowery Street, stands Manhattan's oldest bank, founded in 1834. And close by is Chinatown, where brick buildings have stood for hundreds of years. They have become one of the characteristics of central New York and represent building techniques that relied on the import of this light, dependable material. And that had to be transported to Manhattan, down the Hudson River.
The sloops would carry tons and tons of brick up and down the river. I often will tell students, like, next time you're in New York City, take a look around. You're like, how much brick do you see? You're going to see a lot of brick. And a lot of that brick came from the Hudson Valley and was shipped to New York on sloops.
New York City is constantly rebuilt, over and over again, each skyscraper standing on the rubble of the previous one. A winter sun sets over New York, where the eternal play of glass and steel reflects in the sea and creates a fairy tale skyline of offices where trade never stops. The World Trade Center ship has left New York for conservation in the nation's foremost marine archaeology laboratory. Here in College Station, Texas, Donnie Hamilton and his team have been able to get an intimate picture of the ship found under Ground Zero. Apart from the excitement of having the World Trade Center ship in their hands, the conservators in Texas have the great responsibility of preserving this highly symbolic artifact. They first have to deal with the serious problems that all the nails in the ship pose.
And so we are just now getting to the process. We've gone through all the rinsing. Obviously, in 5 years, all the soluble salts have been rinsed out pretty much. And so now we've been dealing primarily with removing the iron, and that's pretty much has been done now. And then also we've been scanning all the material with the Faro arm, the 3D scanner, so that we can make a complete digital model of the ship.
For about a year, all the timbers will go into a solution of ammonium citrate, which is a chelation, or it'll actually go in and pull out the iron
iron doesn't want to be iron, and so it corrodes. And with salt water, we have a further complication is that it's now the corrosion products are mixed with the sodium chloride from the salt water. And so when you have sodium chloride, you have ferrous chloride and ferric chloride. Once you expose it to the air and the atmospheric moisture, it converts to hydrochloric acid.
We'll start to slowly impregnate polyethylene glycol into the timbers themselves. And once that reaches a certain percentage, we'll then put everything in the freeze dryer for 4 to 6 months, depending on its thickness. And when it comes out, it'll be cleaned and ready to start being reconstructed into the ship itself.
These are all the different vats that have the WTC material in it. They used to be over here being pre-processed, but now they've been measured and scanned, and so we're getting ready to start into the next stage. So we're sequestering all the iron out of it now, and then they'll be taken after they go through the next treatment and put into the freeze dryer. This is the largest archaeological freeze dryer in the Americas by far. It's 8-foot diameter, 40-foot long, and all computer controlled, and essentially it's used for once we get all the iron out of the wood, and then essentially have it pre-treated polyethylene glycol, then it's put into the freeze dryer. Once the water is frozen and you put it in the freeze dryer, then it goes directly from a solid state to a gas state without going through an intervening liquid state. And it's the liquid state that as it dries, the surface tension of the water pulls all the cell walls together. That's what causes the wood to shrink and collapse, is the surface tension of the water evaporating, pulling the cell walls in. So by going directly to a gas state, we eliminate that problem.
The unit is famed for the 17-year-long conservation of La Belle, a French exploration ship discovered in Matagorda Bay.
When we started the Bell project back in 1995, we thought it was going to be a 5-year project. Well, it turned out to be an 18-year project, and at a cost of over $5 million. And so even these, the WTC and the Alexandria, you're talking about more than $500,000 just to do the conservation on these. So the problem is, the cost of doing it, but that's why this lab is a valuable contribution in that we're able to do things here much cheaper than if someone tried to do it on their own and tried to recreate the facilities that we have here.
Meredith Stoops is a volunteer from the Archaeology Postgrad course and has spent months scanning timbers from the World Trade Center ship.
We have to go out to the vats outside and collect individual timbers that we'll bring in to scan. They've been sitting in there for quite a while, so they need cleaned off. The Faro arm it collects very minute information, so anything growing on the timber will be picked up easily, so you have to remove anything like that. So after we've cleaned it off, we bring it in, and you'll place one timber down in front of the scanner. Scan one side, flip it over, and do the next.
Dr. Christopher Dostal has just finished his doctoral thesis on making a scale 3D model of the World Trade Center ship. Using advanced technology, he and volunteers scan the timbers one by one, keeping them wet constantly.
When you're moving this, it has sensors in each of the articulated joints, and if you put too much pressure on one of the sensors, a warning will come up, it'll stop collecting data. And so we were working out in the bay here, and we started to get a lot of error messages from the base of the previous arm that we had. And so we'd had the arm for 9 years, so at this point it was well out of warranty. I'm by no means an engineer, but I thought, well, maybe it's just a loose wire, or maybe it's something, if I take it apart, it's something I'll be able to see if there's a problem. So I brought the arm next door and laid it out on the table, and once I got the final screw out and I pulled the cover off, just a pile of ants fell out.
Scanning the timbers has given the conservators an incredibly accurate picture of how the ship was built.
I'm recreating the ship exactly as it was in the ground. So whatever distortions there might have been, or, if the wood has changed shape over time, or if pieces are broken and fallen into place, that's all going to be perfectly represented in my model. So I'm doing a very good job of recreating what the ship looked like when it was dug up. What Glenn will be doing is taking the shape of the ship is determined by something we call ship lines. So when you're a shipwright, if you're designing a ship, you loft the shape of the ship with a series of lines that project the space through the different dimensions. And so I'm able to use the model this model here to extract the original lines from the ship and then take those, and now we can extrapolate those to get the rest of the ship.
On the campus itself, the team possesses a little celebrated secret asset. It comes in the form of Glenn Grieco, an expert in wooden ships and, especially, building scale models of them. This is the third model of La Belle that he has built.
We start with the remains, and we try to find similar vessels, similar contemporary vessels, and it's just a lot of research, trying to find drafts if they exist, historic documents that mention the construction, or even information about what materials the vessel was going to be carrying. The hull would have to be designed a certain way to carry certain materials. It really differs per vessel, though.
There's two halves to this, right? So whatever's on the table you can't scan. So you scan the top part and as much of the sides as you can, and then you save that, and then you'll scan the next side as much of the sides as you can. And then once you do that, you can go through and find the same point on both scans and tell the computer, hey, like, this little divot here is the same on this scan as it is on this scan, and it'll try and align those two. So if you just keep telling it points over and over again, after about 4 or 5, it does a pretty good alignment. And then what the software will do is it actually track the overlap. It'll sample a certain % of the scan and then refine that alignment.
Scanning the timbers has been complex, and getting the scans of each side to match time-consuming. The match has to be perfect, so that the 3D printer can extrude plastic scale replicas of each timber to build a perfect model, giving Peter Fix and his team something to practice rebuilding the ship with. To make the model accurate, Glenn uses not only all the documentation he can get hold of, but also his own experience in ship lines.
There are 3 or 4 other Dutch vessels that have about the same shape. I looked at all of those to see if there were some features in those that we could use for this. Dutch cargo vessels tend to have very, very full hulls. And in the 1830s and 1840s, when you see what the Hudson River sloops evolved into, they're much finer, much sleeker. So we know this is somewhere in the transition. And looking at the lines that Chris Dostal pulled off of the actual remains, you can see it's a much fuller vessel. And so it still has some of those characteristics of the earlier Dutch vessels.
But so the first thing was to put in the spine, and to take those 3 pieces and fix them together. And then the next was to add the keel, the stern knee back here, which is this big piece here, right? This would have been the main structural support for the end. And then attached to the stern knee is the stern post. That's a separate piece here. And if I get close, you see that when I scanned the stern knee, it actually still had a bolt in the print as well. The main bolt that fixed the two printed perfectly fine. It was scanned perfectly fine. And the hole that it was in scanned fine. So I was able to just use the original fastener to line up the two.
From the skeleton of the ship, he is able to build a 3D photocopy scale model of the World Trade Center ship, which will allow Glenn Grieco to estimate the ship lines.
First of all, we need to come up with a set of lines for a vessel that approximates the shape. And of course, using all the details that we know from other types of vessels and other vessels from the same period, we'll try to incorporate all those details in and come up with a believable hull that accurately reproduces what the original would have looked like.
So this is basically just melted plastic. And what you do is you put the model in, and then the slicing software analyzes the model and then calculates, it just slices it into a lot of thin layers and calculates the path that a 3D printer head would have to take. Each one of these meshes is added to the slicer software, and then the software goes through and maps the route that that piping bag will have to take to build up to this level.
I think what really helps the most is the work that Peter Fix and Chris Dostal did with not only scanning in all the timbers and coming up with a good set of lines, but also the reconstruction, just reassembling them. That always helps.
It very likely was a very broad, flat-shaped bottom with a fairly hard chine. The bilge here, you can see it's a very hard turn. So it would have just been a shallow drafted beamy bus of a boat that could take a lot of people and goods up and down the Hudson River. It almost certainly had a single mast, although we don't have the mast step, but just based on the shape, you couldn't have put more. So there's been a lot of studies of what this ship shape of the Hudson River sloop might be. Regardless of whether or not this matches the previous studies, it was almost certainly a slooped rig boat on the Hudson River.
For many more months, it will be quietly cured and consolidated in the warm rural plains of Texas, where time stands still, before moving back to where it plied its trade, to bear witness to the very origins of New York State, in the freezing northern tip of the United States. On the other side of the United States, far to the north of Manhattan, lies the city of Albany, the capital of New York State. This is where the New York State Museum is housed. Michael Lucas is the curator of historical archaeology.
Well, the first thing is, of course, it's quite rare, and they found this ship, and ships are very interesting for the public, of course, because they're this sort of this little time capsule, a moment sort of in time. And so for me, it was interesting that this particular ship would tie into this larger story of not just New York's role in New York City's role in the development of New York State, but also in the development of the United States during the late 18th and early 19th century. So it's really an interesting way, and the ship sort of becomes a protagonist in this story.
The Dutch didn't have much, you know, in terms of natural resources. They made most of their money by trading with other people and carrying goods on their ships. So they came over here and they looked at Manhattan Island and they said, well, if we have a little settlement at the southern tip of this island, we can control all the trade for this huge hinterland.
Here at the State Museum, we have over 2 million artifacts from Lower Manhattan alone that trace the early European settlements of what was initially New Amsterdam, right through the 20th century. So the ship will be a major part of filling a gap in this collection we have to tell the story of how the city grew and how the state grew.
The longtime director of the museum is Mark Sharming, and he has been managing the 9/11 exhibit for a decade. For all New Yorkers, the World Trade Center ship has a special significance.
And so, of course, it's just symbolic that this great tower, this piece of world history, stood over this ship and was never found. I don't know that they knew it was there when they built the towers. They went down to bedrock, but somehow preserved it as well. And then not to be discovered until the towers collapsed and came down. So that story is pretty amazing as well. We would never know about this except for the terrible destruction of the World Trade Center.
New York State was once the gateway to the west and to the north, and the Hudson River was the thoroughfare to the great expanses of North America. The archaeological context of the World Trade Center ship gives us clues to the historical period that it was active in. One of the most startling discoveries was a button of the 52nd Regiment of Foot, a British infantry unit active in the Revolutionary Wars.
In the case of, if this was a ship that was pressed into service during the Revolutionary War, it would have been a troop transport. There was a button that was found that's from the 52nd Regiment afoot. So it was a Revolutionary War uniform button. Now, does that mean there were soldiers on there from the 52nd? Maybe.
And you know, and what's New York today? You know, it's the trading capital of America, if not part of the world. And where was this vessel? In the World Trading Center, you know, World Trade Center. So it all fits to the history. It has huge significance to Manhattan and America that it was there. Now, it wasn't meant to be, you know, under the World Trade Center, but there it was. So, you know, looking back from the World Trade Center that's been rebuilt now, here's a piece of that history that developed this island.
The mystery ship was built in Philadelphia and sank in New York around the time of the nation's independence. It offers a mere glimpse of what life was like when the city and the nation were young. As millions of the world's downtrodden came to the windswept Hudson to make new lives, the sloop was buried in the foundations of the World Trade Center. 200 years later, the Twin Towers were attacked and destroyed, taking nearly 3,000 lives with them.
I live in a small rural area of Maine, and so everybody has 5 hats, you know, and one of my hats was I was a volunteer fireman, and 33 years. I was a captain at the time at the World Trade Center, got hit, and was an EMT for 20 years. And so, you know, we saw those guys going in, they didn't come out. 4 of those guys had been our instructors. You know, so I knew 2 of them a little bit. But it wasn't just that, it was this whole concept of these people going, that's what we do, you know. So I had that personal connection too. So when we went to the site, it wasn't just as an American, but it was also the firefighter, EMT, and me, and the archaeologist all coming together. So I'm not an emotional person, but it is pretty emotional for me.
For 250 years, New York City has grown on the remains of humble ships like this one, built with the same wood as Independence Hall. Today, above the very spot where it was found, the glistening One World Trade Center rises into the sky, a towering symbol of the United States of America's resolve to rebuild and remain the global center of commerce. On the 18th of April 2015, more than 700 children, women and men from Africa drowned in the worst tragedy of the migrant crisis. It was not the first such tragedy, nor the last, but it was one of the most horrific. The few survivors arrived in the dead of night at the port of Catania. In the days and weeks to follow, prosecutors opened an investigation into what happened, and the Italian government made the unprecedented decision to raise the boat from 370 meters underwater. It was a ship salvage like none other, with tools and lifting mechanisms custom built to lift the migrant boat from a remote, deep resting place in the middle of the Mediterranean. The migrant crisis has been an ongoing human tragedy for at least a decade. But after the Arab Spring of 2011, the sheer numbers of people attempting the dangerous crossing of the Sicilian Channel has exploded, as has the number of fatalities. On the 3rd of October 2013, 360 Africans died a few hundred meters from the coast of Lampedusa when their boat caught fire, causing it to capsize. The tragedy changed the course of Italian policy, with Navy and Coast Guard ships pushing out closer to the Libyan coastline to intercept the rickety boats and save lives. obliging civilian ships to change course to meet migrant boats in difficulty. On the night of 18th of April 2015, panicked passengers stampeded to one side on an overcrowded fishing boat, causing the vessel to tip over. Only 28 people survived, telling authorities there may have been up to 800 people packed onto the boat, many in the hull. It is this kind of dramatic and gruesome incident, like this scene filmed by the Italian Navy in May 2016, that sailors and rescuers have witnessed over and over again in the Mediterranean as the migrant crisis has worsened. The government ordered the boats salvaged from the bottom of the sea in order to identify the victims and further the investigation into the deadly human trafficking.
È stato un impegno notevole, però da una parte
it was a hard job, but I knew that it was doable, and on the other hand, I had the support of well-trained people.
Il supporto di personale
professionally valid, I'd say, at the international level.
Di livello, direi, internazionale.
Sapevamo che cosa c'era dentro, sapevamo.
We knew what was inside it. We knew why it was on that seafloor. So it was also a satisfaction having gotten those people out of the dark and the cold, deep water.
The Italian government's approach to the Mediterranean humanitarian crisis has been to apply the law of the sea, whereby anyone in difficulty should be rescued. By pushing the Navy and search and rescue patrol ships out to the very edges of Libyan territorial waters, Italy and the EU's naval operations have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The Italian Navy was tasked by the government also with raising the migrant ship. The complex salvage would involve finding a large offshore supply ship to use as a platform, to which a gantry would be bolted with strand jacks that could provide the pulling power for a customized robotic lifting module that would be lowered down to fit snugly around the sunken ship to bring it to the surface of the sea. Egidio Ibba was the project manager for the Italian diving and marine contractor Impresub, specialized in subsea work, and which was given the contract to raise the ship by the Italian Navy.
È stata fatta una gara per l'assegnazione di questo incarico.
There was a competition to assign this task, a task that involved the verification of the state of the wreck
di tutte le informazioni al contorno
and of all the information surrounding it, so as to go on to study a method of recovery and carry out the operation clear to the delivery of the wreck with its cargo to the Italian authorities.
Con il suo carico alle autorità italiane.
Based in the northern Italian city of Trento, the company Impresub operates mainly in the area of offshore hydrocarbon business to lay pipelines in trenches at the bottom of the sea. Building its own equipment, these dangerous and complex underwater endeavors are the backbone of Impresub's business. But the company's expertise has also been employed in judicial investigations. Impresub had crucial experience in salvaging a migrant vessel. Long before the migrant crisis of the 2000s shined a spotlight on the deadly crossings of the Mediterranean, there was the Albanian migrant crisis of the 1990s, triggered after the collapse of the Albanian economy.
Nel 1997
in 1997, at the request of the Brindisi prosecutor's office, we recovered the wreck of an Albanian motorboat, the catastrophe that sank after a collision with the Italian Navy corvette Sibilla in the channel of Otranto 800 meters deep. That was the recovery that probably still holds the record of depth for a whole wreck.
Probabilmente mantiene ancora il record di profondità per un relitto intero.
Thousands of Albanians fled to Italy. There were many incidents at sea, and there were 52 victims on the vessel that Imprasub had been tasked to salvage. It was the deepest ship salvage on record in the Mediterranean.
Oltre alla profondità che impediva l'impiego di uomini in qualunque condizione, richiedeva il recupero del relitto in...
Apart from the depth that impeded the use of men in any case, it required the recovery of the whole wreck so that it could be investigated and the causes and the dynamics of the sinking verified, which is what we actually did, as well as having brought to the surface and giving to their families the bodies of 52 Albanian refugees that were trapped inside the motorboat.
Ai familiari le salme di 52 albanesi, profughi albanesi che erano rimasti intrappolati dentro la motovedetta.
Imprasub's prior experience salvaging a migrant ship would be critical. This salvage operation was less deep, but involved many more victims and was located just off the coast of Libya, a lawless stretch of sea necessitating extra security measures. The tragic sinking of a migrant boat on the 18th of April 2015 led to an unprecedented decision by the Italian government to raise the ship from the bottom of the sea in international waters. The team that was chosen to raise it was all Italian.
Abbiamo individuato nella Fagioli di Reggio Emilia il partner ideale.
We identified in Fagioli of Reggio Emilia the ideal partner to supply a lifting system that was different and more suitable, safer than the system we used previously.
Più sicuro rispetto a quanto avevamo sperimentato in precedenza.
Per recuperare questo relitto avevamo già un'idea condivisa rapidamente con la Imprasub.
To recover this wreck, we already had an idea that we had shared with Imprasub, which was to use a stable ship, a large ship, onto which our standard equipment could be mounted so as to raise the wreck safely, and therefore we thought about a steel structure that supported the strand jacks that would actually carry and raise the wreck from the bottom of the sea. The strand jacks were the fundamental element, the muscle of the arm that recovered the wreck.
Il muscolo del braccio che ha raccolto il relitto.
Once the team had been selected, the project involved 3 phases, the first of which was to get an accurate picture of the ship's location and surroundings by doing a digital survey with cameras, robotic sensors, and mapping software. The team tasked with the first inspection of the vessel left in October of 2015 to head to the migrant ship location, 76 nautical miles off Libya and 165 nautical miles from Sicily.
Uno degli aspetti determinanti.
One of the determining aspects that conditioned heavily the choice, over and above the location of the conditions, was also the, let's say, the lack of a precise drawing of the wreck to recover. The lack of a plan of what the ship looked like was one of the determining factors that conditioned our decision.
Recuperare.
Le operazioni di ispezione, quindi la prima fase
The inspection operation, the first phase of the project, was carried out in October 2015.
Abbiamo adottato per la prima volta una tecnica di fotogrammetria subacquea.
We adopted a photometrical underwater technique for the first time, which involved acquiring a number of reference points shown in images using very high-definition cameras.
Con telecamere ad altissima definizione. Tutto questo ovviamente poi è stato posto a confronto di altre informazioni provenienti
that was then compared with other information coming from visual and sonar instruments, coming from beacons that we set up on the sea floor.
sul fondo in prossimità del relitto.
La parte emersa dello scafo era abbastanza significativa.
The part of the ship that was above the sea floor was very large, and the hidden part was reconstructed based on the results of the photogrammetric images of the wreck. So we tried to interpolate the data that we had so that there were no holes, and there was a good level of agreement between the data.
Soluzione di continuità, ci fosse un buon livello di raccordo fra le parti.
The first survey provided engineers with critical images and parameters of the ship and an accurate map of the seafloor terrain, clues to potential obstacles, information that would be used to design and build a lifting system of the right shape and size. The team was able to determine the length, breadth and height of the ship, but also get an estimate of its weight.
La posizione dei 4 punti di sollevamento è stata vincolata da quelle che erano le dimensioni del relitto.
The positioning of the lifting points was determined by the size of the wreck, and what we had estimated was the area within which the center of gravity of the wreck would fall. We estimated that the load could be doubled compared to the weight we had estimated, due to dynamic movements.
Di tutto l'insieme.
The survey showed the state of the ghostly ship in detail. It was an opportunity to establish the state of the hull that would be under the greatest material stress during the lift. And of course, the boat was full of hundreds of victims, whose dignity was to be preserved as far as possible during the lift.
Vedendo quei corpi, perché noi ovviamente che abbiamo effettuato l'operazione siamo stati...
Seeing those bodies, because obviously we, who carried out the operation, were exposed in close contact with the poor bodies, and having to work so closely with death, day and night, for us obviously did not leave us indifferent. And the first sign we gave of this thought process was deposing a crown of flowers on the bridge of the fishing boat when we carried out the first survey of the ship in October.
Effettuammo la prima ispezione.
The second phase of the process involved accurately designing the tools to do the job. The lifting module that perfectly fitted the size of the hull. The boat was 22 meters long and 7 meters wide, and to fit snugly around it, the module would have to be 29 by 16.
Il modulo aveva una lunghezza di circa 30 metri.
The module was about 30 meters long and would be positioned transversal to the beam of the ship.
Posizionato trasversalmente rispetto alla nave. La larghezza del modulo era circa...
The module was about 10 meters wide, so we had a space, a surface that was outboard, which was about 30 meters by 10, over and beyond the stern of the ship.
Al di là della linea di poppa della nave.
However, the added complication was that the size of the fishing boat required 4 long, extensible chocks to be installed on each side of the module. These would have to be hydraulically powered and so connected to a power supply. The engineers custom-made a system to connect the chocks to a power pack they had built using the power supply heart of the ROV. The tailor-made power pack was installed at the stern of the module. The lifting unit would be provided by Italy's foremost heavy lift company, Fratelli.
Ci sono dei cunei che meccanicamente vengono spinti all'interno di alcune sedi.
There are wedges that are placed inside the system that mechanically block each cable inside the steel structure. There can be many cables in proportion to the weight to be lifted, starting with a single strand of 15 tons and a maximum of 750 tons with 50 strands per strand jack.
Quindi minimo 15 tonnellate fino ad un massimo di 700 tonnellate con 50 strand per ogni singolo strand jack.
To increase the speed of construction, the lifting equipment was based on an existing structure that had been used to build the Venetian mobile tidal dam known as the Mosè. However, certain changes needed to be made to adapt the systems to fit the migrant ship salvage specs.
Beh, le soluzioni possibili che ci sono venute in mente a me e a tutto il nostro team.
We studied the possible solutions that came to my mind and the mind of the whole team, the ones that involved giving the ability to raise the wreck that was at 370 meters underwater in the fastest time possible and lowering to great depth steel cables 18 millimeters wide and with a load of 15 tons at a speed of 15 to 20 meters an hour.
Anche con delle velocità abbastanza sostenute nell'ordine dei 15-20 metri all'ora.
Finding a ship that could house 35 team members over and above the crew and provide the base platform for the salvage operation, plus be able to lift the wreck without ripping off the deck, was the next challenge. Again, Impresub searched for an Italian solution. The other essential parameter was dynamic stability. The ship had to be able to remain stable even in rough weather.
Questo è il sistema di grillage.
This is the grillage system that was used to redistribute the forces that were produced during the lifting process. Redistributing them over the ship deck, each individual beam was about 28 meters long. The beams were 1.5 meters high. The height from the ship's deck to the lifting point of the strand jacks was 9 meters. The length of each cable had to be 400 meters, each individual strand.
Ciascun cavo doveva essere di circa 400 metri, ogni singolo strand.
Si trattava di scegliere la piattaforma, ovvero il mezzo navale di supporto più idoneo a sostenere le attrezzature.
We had to choose the platform, so a suitable ship platform to hold all the equipment, house all the technical personnel over and beyond the crew, that offered guarantees of stability on the sea in prohibitive conditions. And we identified the Ievoli Ivory that, at that moment, was the best unit to which we have to add the availability of a 100-ton compensated crane able to operate up to 2,000 meters.
Da 100 tonnellate compensata, in grado di operare fino a 2000 metri.
The Ievoli Ivory is an Italian offshore supply ship built in 2015 and weighing 4,693 tons. Now that it had been chosen and the general parameters of the module and lifting mechanism were established, work could begin on refining the project down to the last details. There were two problems that the gantry and strand jacks posed.
Le marre sono state, sì, molto complicate da disegnare perché siamo rimasti.
The chocks were very complicated to design because we were required that they not contribute too much to the overall dimensions of the module, so as not to have it interfere between our structure and Fagioli's.
Struttura è quella che Fagioli aveva creato. Appunto, essendo definito l'ingombro massimo,
once we had established the maximum dimensions when they were extended fully, they were not to have exceeded the internal profile of the frame, and this further complicated the mechanical design significantly.
Meccanica abbastanza significativa.
The module, once designed, was contracted to the Rossetti plant in Ravenna, known for their work on oil rigs the world over and for supplying the subsea platforms that the Costa Concordia rested on after it was righted in 2014. But this operation to raise the migrant boat had its own set of challenges.
A causa delle dimensioni e la volontà anche di contenere al massimo i pesi.
Due to its dimensions and the need to limit weight, as well as the need to build a single structure all in one block that could not be rebuilt on location, we decided to build it close to the sea so it could be easy to transfer from the site to the ship. So this allowed us to have a speedy construction, as we were using the consolidated know-how of the naval shipyards that built the module.
Le competenze ormai consolidate all'interno del cantiere navale che ha proceduto alla costruzione.
Especially delicate were the places where the lifting cables and the module were connected. Unlike the 1997 wreck lift, this time the 4 strand jacks would be connected to 4 places on the module.
Questi qui sono gli strand jack, sono stati posizionati, come le dicevo, 4 strand jack.
These are the strand jacks. They have been positioned, as you can see, 4 strand jacks, and each one had cables, single strands, that were lowered, and these were attached to anchoring involving pad eyes, lifting eyes, and these housings were then attached to the recovery module.
Le stesse fixed anchor housing sono state poi alla fine attaccate al modulo di recupero.
Lowering the module to 370 meters below the surface would have taken an inordinate length of time.
Il sistema di sollevamento aveva 2.
The lifting system involved 2 beams that mounted 4 double-strand jack systems.
Quindi 8 strand jack in tutto. Ciascuno di questi era in grado di sollevare 150 tonnellate.
8 strand jacks in all, each of which was able to lift 150 tons at a maximum speed of 20 meters per hour. The advantage of this system was to have 4 lifting points that allowed us to lift the wreck to the surface in a horizontal position.
Furthermore, given the height of the migrant boat, the superstructures would have to be removed before it was lifted to the surface completely, so as not to interfere with the gantry. The Italian Navy tested the project in January 2016, and the Italian Maritime Registry, RINA, green-lighted the operation shortly afterwards. The crew and recovery team mobilized on the 21st of March 2016, and the ship was prepared for over a month. They were ready to depart on the 20th of April, when they believed the weather would be stable enough to recover the boat. The Jevoli Ivory left Ravenna port on the 21st of April 2016 for the remote location close to the Libyan coastline, where the migrant ship that sank with 700 souls on board lay at 370 meters below the waves. The team tested the module at the bottom of the sea to check that all systems worked, and then the ship proceeded to the site.
Abbiamo fatto partire la mobilitazione, ovvero l'allestimento delle attrezzature sulla nave, subito dopo la...
We began mobilization, or preparation of equipment on the ship, after the first half of March. This activity of mobilization lasted a month, and then we took to the sea about the 20th of April from Ravenna, where we carried out the tests.
Da Ravenna, dove abbiamo completato anche I collaudi, ci sono dei...
There are checks and tests that can only be carried out at a full depth and not in the port. So along the way we stopped and we carried out our checks and our fine-tuning.
Le nostre messe a punto.
Once on site, a new visual inspection showed that the boat's hull had not deteriorated since the first survey in October 2015. An independent ROV began working on removing the superstructures, cables and railings that might have become caught up in the lifting cables, and generally cleaning the area of debris. The weather did not promise an easy lift, but the Impresub and Fagioli teams got to work all the same. The ROV also used circular saws to slice through the hull of the boat to open holes to allow water to flow out freely, so that the strand jacks would not have to lift the weight of the ship plus the water it contained.
E la prima operazione in acqua è stata quella di procedere.
The first operation underwater was to go forward with a vehicle holding a mono-hydraulic saw that we used to cut the superstructures that would have stopped us from recovering the wreck, so we cut off the masts and the extruding structures, and this operation was carried out in not ideal sea conditions, but for this type of operation, this wasn't particularly important.
Di mare non ottimali, però per il tipo di operazione non erano vincolanti.
Fino a quel momento avevamo visto solo delle fotografie e qualche disegno.
Until then, we had only seen photographs and drawings. So when we arrived on location, we followed the descent of the ROV, and to see in real time the wreck left us all, I'd say, speechless at that moment.
Appena arrivati in luogo abbiamo posizionato un beacon.
When we arrived on the location, we positioned a beacon on the seafloor close to the wreck. The ship carried out all its tests, including dynamic positioning. We checked that all the signals were stable and constant.
Le lamiere del fasciame erano abbastanza
The metal sheeting and the ribbing were quite deteriorated as far as the steel was concerned. But the fishing boat did not have structural breaks, apparently. And in fact, this was the case. Because if there had been any under the mud, we would never have been able to see them.
Se ci fossero state sotto il fango, non le avremmo potute evidentemente individuare.
La nave ha mantenuto la stessa posizione del tempo del Salvage di alcuni mesi precedenti.
The ship had kept its position that we had observed several months before. It was slightly listing to the left, but rested completely on the bottom and was in the sand bottom by about 50 to 60 centimeters. It was more or less horizontal, so in a favorable position for the recovery.
Una posizione favorevole per le operazioni di recupero.
The ship was accompanied by units of the Italian Navy that were on standby just in case there was an emergency of any kind and to provide logistical support.
Non va dimenticato al grande supporto e apporto che la Marina Militare stessa.
We should not forget the massive support and help that the Navy gave us, both in terms of logistics and in terms of safety, since we had to operate not very far from the Libyan coastline.
Non elevata dalle coste libiche.
Praticamente tutelavano il percorso delle nostre operazioni.
Practically, they protected the ongoing activities. There was already a wreck underneath us, and there was no saying that another might not happen there, and that would have stopped our operations and created delays and problems that had to be avoided at all costs.
Dovevamo escludere tutti i costi.
The crew and team waited for a window of 5 whole days of fine weather to ensure that the lift would work smoothly. With 20 hours for getting the module to the bottom of the sea and another 20 to get it up, the 5 whole days were deemed necessary for the operation to be successful. At last, on the 9th of May, the weather reports suggested a window of opportunity. Slowly, the module was lowered by the team, and at last the ROV could confirm that it lay at exactly the right place at the bottom of the sea. The module's hydraulic chocks were extended under the muddy surface of the seabed.
Abbiamo impiegato una ventina di ore per arrivare a...
It took about 20 hours to get the module to 400 meters below the surface, given that we had to carry out several checks on the way down to verify the system was working. And when we got to 350 to 360 meters deep, there was a further briefing on the following phases that we would have to follow to grab the vessel and begin the lift.
In the hours following the initial contact between module and the boat, the weather began to worsen.
Non avendo una visuale completa, perché sotto il relitto ovviamente non potevamo vedere che cosa era successo.
Since we didn't have a full view of the boat because we couldn't see under it and how the chocks had caught the boat, the detachment from the sea bottom was very slow, and we waited until visibility at the bottom was perfect to be able to check the whole structure and the wreck within the module before starting the lift.
E del relitto all'interno del modulo, prima di iniziare la risalita.
In the afternoon, there was a 50-knot wind, creating hazardous waves, with the ship pitching by 4 meters, making even the smallest operation difficult.
Noi che operiamo in questo settore la conosciamo bene perché è una zona di interesse e di attività di estrazione del petrolio.
We who operate in this sector know it well, because it is an area for oil extraction in the Sirte Gulf, and the sea in the southern Mediterranean is always at the center of poor weather and vortexes, where high and low pressure meet that create permanent low pressure in a circular movement in that area. We know the area, the Sirte Gulf.
Questa bassa pressione in moto circolare in quell'area.
No one can control the weather, and the wind gusts forced us to trigger an emergency procedure once it was halfway up. So in about 8 hours, we put the wreck back on the seafloor. They had to put the boat back down.
The weather on the surface got worse and kept on worsening drastically, because we had personnel involved in outside activity on the beams, and the safety factor forced us in this emergency, let's say, to decide to stop the operation and reposition the wreck on the seafloor to wait for better conditions.
A quel punto abbiamo recuperato il modulo in superficie.
At that point, we brought the module back to the surface with not a few problems. All went well, luckily, apart from the breakages that we would have to repair to be able to proceed with the operations.
Chiaramente riparare per poter procedere con l'operazione.
È ovvio che quando si parte con un'operazione e si arriva anche oltre la metà dell'operazione stessa.
Obviously, if you start an operation and reach more than halfway through it, having to interrupt it and go back to the beginning of the operation is not pleasant, both because we were working in difficult conditions with long shifts, day and night, and unfavorable environment, and when you're close to the end, having to go back to the beginning is frustrating, but our personnel and technicians are used to keeping calm and concentrating to reach the goal safely.
I nostri tecnici sono abituati a mantenere la calma e la concentrazione per raggiungere l'obiettivo in modo sicuro.
The Italian salvage workers, trying so hard to recover the migrant ship, began to wonder if perhaps the sea did not want to give up this watery tomb.
L'impressione da marinaio che avevamo a bordo in certi momenti un po' di preoccupazione, però
The impression we sailors had on board, we were worried. But with tenacity and determination, we all, no one excluded aboard, worked even harder and even more as a team to overcome this sensation that was growing.
Per riuscire a vincere questa sensazione che si andava maturando.
Effettivamente sembrava che questo relitto non volesse venire via.
It seemed that this wreck did not want to come away with us. We all wanted to succeed in this operation, so any small incident put everyone's nerves on edge because we all wanted to do it at last.
Insomma, perché volevamo effettivamente farcela, insomma.
The Ivory made its way back to the Sicilian port of Augusta, where repairs could take place. Weeks would go by before the ship and recovery system were ready again after the aborted mission to recover the migrant ship.
Ci abbiamo impiegato una ventina di giorni.
It took us 20-odd days as we had to wait for spars, we had to change strad jacks, we had to unravel the cables, organize special transports, and what with Sundays and so forth, it took a long time.
Il tutto si è trascinato in questi tempi.
Siamo rientrati appunto ad Augusta per fare
We returned to Augusta to carry out checks on the whole structure because after stresses they were subject to, we had to check the state of the cables after the continuous oscillations that they were subject to during the lifting process.
Che si sono verificati durante il primo stato di sollevamento. Beh, ovviamente anche le travi, perché essendo una struttura a sbalzo, era ovviamente
and obviously the beams as well. They were protruding from the ship, and although they were designed to be subject to those kinds of forces, for the greater safety of the project, we preferred to check them once more.
Del progetto, insomma, abbiamo preferito verificare di nuovo tutta la struttura.
On the 5th of June, the Jevoli Ivory took to the sea once again and headed for the wreck location where at last operations could begin anew.
Abbiamo fatto alcune modifiche per meglio garantirci da queste situazioni.
We made a few changes to protect us from the situation created by the high waves that were higher than those set by our safety limits. And then we took to the sea once more.
E poi abbiamo ripreso il mare.
Il meteo era fluttuante.
The weather was changing. It wasn't as though there was bad weather all the time. There was a month of bad weather, then 3 or 4 days of bad weather again, then 1.5 days of nice weather, then a fine day, and then it all started again. So we never had a window of good weather that allowed us to finish the operations.
At last, on the 26th of June 2016, the module could be lowered. The migrant boat was captured and the system began lifting again.
Tutte le unità siamo in sollevamento col relitto dentro il modulo. Ottimo lavoro, andiamo avanti, grazie.
This time, the weather held long enough for the cleaning operations to take place at 12 meters depth, shallow enough for the divers to be able to access the boat freely, remove the bridge and protruding superstructures in order to raise the boat above the surface. Some remains of the victims were also removed.
Con successivi tentativi di intraprendere l'operazione interrotta spesso in fase iniziale.
With several attempts to restart an operation that had been stopped and started many times, we arrived at the 26th of June, when we finally managed to complete the recovery that lasted 4 to 5 consecutive days.
In forma continuativa.
Beh, allora il giorno del successo lo ricordo con...
The day of success, I remember with great satisfaction and great emotion because in any case, it was a very long period and we were at work for 3 months at this operation, and there were days that we all believed we could recover this vessel without difficulty. But then instead, there were days that were very difficult. There were days that it seemed that maybe it wasn't even possible to carry out this operation.
Che questa operazione quasi non si potesse fare.
Messo tutto in sicurezza, il tempo era buono, era previsto buono durare ancora un paio di giorni.
We had everything secured and the weather was good for several consecutive days, and we thought we were going to be able to carry it out tranquilly, but the weather was not favorable, and we had to secure again the vessel and navigate with difficult seas and at a speed of 0.1 knots.
Mare, perciò la navigazione di rientro è stata fatta circa a .1 nodo.
Anche durante il viaggio di ritorno, insomma, il maltempo non ci ha lasciato tregua, nel senso che noi
Even on the return voyage, the weather did not give us a break. In this trip, where we had the vessel attached, chained behind our ship, so we had this unusual cargo attached to our ship, also during the navigation. So the commander, for more safety, preferred to wait for a moment that was more favorable for navigation.
più favorevole per la navigazione.
Finally, the boat was lifted to the surface. At last, the remains of hundreds of victims trapped inside the boat's hull could be turned over to forensic analysts in Sicily and eventually given a dignified burial. The incredible salvage of the migrant boat is testament to Italy's promise that these people's plight would not be forgotten, that the deadly voyage across the Mediterranean no longer remains hidden beneath the deep, dark waters in the Straits of Sicily. Ships can be salvaged. Lives cannot. Despite the heroic efforts of Italy's Coast Guard and Navy, the hopes and dreams of thousands of those who perished during similar voyages still lie buried at the bottom of the sea, after what was the most dangerous and deadly year on record for refugees and migrants attempting to cross the Mediterranean. An unforgiving Atlantic storm in August 2016 caught a lonely tug by surprise as it towed a massive orange oil rig on its last journey before destruction. Lashed by high winds and waves, the Transocean Winner broke the tow and crashed into the shoreline of Britain's westernmost island, famed for its spectacular sea views and landscapes. 2 weeks later, it was refloated and towed round the tip of the island. Only 2 months later could it be removed once and for all, in a triumph of technology, as it was lifted out of the sea. For 2 months, the islanders watched anxiously as the head of salvage for the United Kingdom laid the groundwork for a successful salvage. On the morning of August the 8th, 2016, the shocked residents of Dalmore Beach on the island of Lewis in the Outer Hebrides woke up to find an orange steel monster washed up against the rocks of their wild coast. A massive 17,000-ton oil rig had appeared out of nowhere. Photographs of the Transocean Winner quickly went round the world, the spectacular, barren beauty of the place contrasting with the environmental hazard the rig represented.
This was a massive steel structure embedded firmly on our shores, and we didn't know what damage that was doing to our shores. We don't know what pollution that might be causing to our environment. So we all struggled for a couple of days wondering what the implications were for us.
I'm sure the costs were substantial, the salvors, the number of vessels that were there, but it would be fair to say that throughout the operation itself that primacy was given to just coming up with the best response and ensuring that the operation was carried out safely without any damage to the environment.
The Transocean winner is a particularly challenging cargo because we don't know exactly what the weight of the rig is. She's damaged. She's been laying around on rocks getting bigger and bigger damages over several weeks before our vessel arrived.
What became evident straight away was that the rig was stuck on the rocks and would not be easy to dislodge. The UK Coast Guard was on the scene already, as they had been warned that the tug towing the rig was in trouble.
I first heard about the incident just after 22:30 on the Sunday night before she grounded, just to let me know that the tug in tow was in difficulty. There was a danger of the line parting. And in early hours the following day, I was advised that the line had parted and the rig actually grounded on the Isle of Lewis just around about 0600 hours.
Britain's Maritime and Coast Guard Authorities headquarters is in Southampton, and this is where the United Kingdom's representative of the Secretary of State for Maritime Salvage operates from, managing maritime emergencies. He flew to the island of Lewis to coordinate the salvage and hear what the owners of the rig had to say. An emergency crew was quickly sent aboard to survey the damage. What they found alarmed the local population. At least 2 of the diesel oil tanks that supplied the 4 engines were ruptured.
Salvage options, Smit Salvage were appointed by Transocean with a view to carry out an assessment and to refloat the rig itself. But obviously in the back of my mind, the other thought I did have was if they didn't manage to successfully refloat her, then we may be looking at a wreck removal operation, which would have been extremely difficult in that exposed part of the coast. It may just have been cutting the whole installation down, starting to remove some of the heavy equipment, but in the exposed area she was, that would not have been a quick option, and we would have probably been looking at well over a year for completion of that operation itself.
The rig's owners, Transocean, contacted the world's foremost salvage company, Smit Salvage, based close to Rotterdam and equipped with its own tugs and equipment to do the job in a hurry. Smit's long history of successes includes participating in raising the Kursk submarine and, more recently, the 2 car carriers, Tricolour and Baltic Ace. The Dutch company sent a unique salvage master with experience in refloating snagged rigs. Smit's salvage master, Sylvia Tervoort, had experience in recovering another oil rig, this time in Alaska. Shell's Kuluk had similarly broken loose and run aground. The Kuluk was refloated and towed away, a solution Smit and Transocean hoped to apply here too. The Transocean Winner is a 17,000-ton semi-submersible oil rig that for years was used for prospecting the seafloor for reserves of hydrocarbon fuels.
The rig itself, I think she first came into commission in the early 80s. She was on passage from Norway to Malta. She weighed about 17,000 tons itself, and dimension-wise she was approximately 70 metres by 70 metres by about 40 metres depth.
She has 3 cranes, a bridge and a helicopter landing deck, and can accommodate 108 people on board. On the night of the wreck, the rig was unmanned, but it did contain 280 tons of diesel oil for propulsion.
When the salvors managed to get on board the rig itself, they found there was significant damage to the tanks down in the sponsons or the pontoons. The pontoons itself, they included the tanks for the water ballast, and also the fuel was kept down there. And it was fairly quickly ascertained that at least 2 of the 4 fuel oil tanks had been breached. And it was estimated that about 53 cubic metres of diesel had been lost during the impact of the grounding itself.
The Transocean Winner is a semi-submersible rig, which means it floats on the sea with a maximum depth of 450 metres and is held in place by 8 anchors. It is able to drill to a depth of 7,600 metres into the sea floor to explore for hydrocarbons. It is equipped with 2 45-metre long cranes and 1 shorter 20-metre long knuckle crane for movements on board. The rig was already old, and this was to be its final voyage, as overhauling it would not have been cost-effective in the depressed oil industry. Deep water exploration is a speciality of the Transocean Company, whose headquarters are in Switzerland, with offices all over the world. It wasn't Transocean's first brush with disaster. Transocean owned the BP-operated Deepwater Horizon rig that caught fire in the Gulf of Mexico, killing 11 and causing an oil spill among the worst in American history. Ultimately, BP was held responsible for the incident. On the night of August the 8th, 2016, the Transocean Winner was being towed by this tug, Alp Forward, owned by Dutch company Alp Maritime. It is 65 metres long, 18.5 metres wide, and has a draft of 8.8 metres.
She was on her way from Norway to Malta. The intention was in Malta she would be decommissioned, and then she would be towed the smaller distance then from Malta to Turkey for recycling.
The Alp Forward and Transocean Winner combination set sail on August the 7th from Stavanger in Norway, one of Europe's oil and energy capitals and, like most of the Norwegian coast, a breathtaking place known for its mountains and beautiful fjords. With the Transocean Winner in tow, the tug left Norway heading for Malta via the open Atlantic around the west coast of Scotland. The Transocean Winner was at the end of its career and was due to be dismantled and later scrapped. The rig and tug duo left their location in the North Sea despite a weather warning that a big Atlantic storm was brewing. These storms can be devastating. The ghostly rig was empty as the Alp Forward pushed down the Atlantic. The rocky coastline of northern Scotland is strewn with hidden dangers, with its highly irregular sea floor. And yet, every year, thousands of cargo ships, often laden with dangerous chemicals, sail by close in to shore.
Most of the heavy traffic that passes these islands tends to travel to the west of us. And that includes vessels that will be carrying some really potentially difficult cargo if it were to find itself onto our shores. We have crude oil tankers that pass us by, and they're only passing by in the Deepwater Channel 2 miles off our shores. And we also have vessels with chemicals on board that would be dangerous and hazardous to the environment. They pass by very, very close.
The route shown by the AIS signal sent by the tug suggests that it may have been trying to enter the bay to gain shelter from the storm. But what actually happened will be the subject of an investigation. At 6 a.m. on August the 8th, 2016, the Alp Forward's tow line broke and the crew were unable to control the rig. The local residents were aghast.
The vessel that was towing the oil rig at about 6 p.m. on the evening of the 7th put out a call to the Coast Guard to say that it needed assistance, that it was having difficulty with the tow. A towing vessel based in Orkney was then commissioned to come to its assistance, but it was some 18 hours away. So the towing vessel, as we understand it, for the next several hours between 6 p.m. and 4 in the morning, struggled and lost the battle to hold this oil rig on its own.
There was nothing that could be done now. The rig was on its own. The tug made its way to the shelter of the port of Stornoway, where it was kept on hand for the salvage. The Outer Hebrides, the islands of Lewis, Harris, North and South Uist, are the westernmost islands of Scotland. There is nothing between here and Newfoundland. Lewis is exposed to everything the Atlantic can throw at it: wind, storms and dense fog. Lewis is an incredibly isolated place, and getting salvage crews in and out of the island was no small feat. There are flights from the smaller airports of Scotland and twice daily ferries from Ullapool. The rig ran aground near the small community of Carloway on the northwestern shore of the island, famed for its black houses, reminiscent of ancient Viking homes, and the magnificent moors that stretch up to steep cliffs and secluded bays. The rugged, rocky coastline is home to seabirds, and its barren moors are dotted with calm lakes known for their wild trout. Close to Dalmore Beach, where the Transocean winner ran aground, are the Callanish stones, all that is left of the Neolithic culture that once thrived on the island. They still lend an eerie sense of mystery to this farthest west of all the British Isles, where people still speak Gaelic. The local residents are mostly employed in the traditional Scottish Highland activities, such as fishing and sheep farming. The Scottish black-faced sheep are shorn for the wool that is spun and then woven into the world-class woolen cloth known as Harris tweed. Close to the site of the Transocean winner wreck is a family-owned Carloway tweed factory.
Cut off the bit with all the knots in it, and this is what I cut off on Monday morning when I started, still in the run from the previous tweed. About 150 years ago, Lady Dunmore, I think her name was, from Aminsuya Castle, she started taking samples of the local tweed which the crofters were making about 150 years ago onto the mainland to show her friends down in London and Perthshire and all these places. And they liked it so much that they started placing orders for it. And that's where the business started about 150 years ago with Lady Dunmore.
For the locals, the massive beached oil rig was mostly an odd curiosity that brought a few new faces into town. But behind the scenes, many also had serious environmental concerns about the potential impact of an oil spill so close to shore.
The main concern for me was the diesel oil itself. The position where the rig was grounded was less than 4 miles to one of the most environmentally sensitive areas on the island, Loch Rogue. It is designated in 2 areas as a conservation area, and also there were 27 aquaculture sites in the loch itself. So our concern was that any oil, if it was to migrate in that direction, could have potentially caused a lot of damage, to the industry there.
Dalmore Beach is one of the island's best and is world famous for surfing. The white beaches and the Caribbean green waters of Lewis belie the extremely cold temperatures of the sea. The wreck of the Transocean winner was a blight on the island's broad horizon and threatened this remote and renowned surfer's paradise.
Well, surfing is a hugely important and popular activity here, particularly at Dalmore Beach, where the Transocean winner oil rig is. It is one of the best surfing beaches anywhere in the United Kingdom, and not only do people come there to enjoy it, people come there to be trained, to be taught how to surf. So very, very important in this area.
On the morning of August the 8th, 2016, The rig was firmly wedged on the rocks of the headland south of the beach. The horizontal crossbar of the rig was stuck fast between the rocks. The westerly winds were still strong, and the local Coast Guard rushed to the scene. These images were filmed by one of the first responders. The first photographs made world news. Salvors managed to climb aboard, but were trapped by bad weather for 2 days. They assessed the damage and activated the generators. They found out that 2 of the oil tanks were breached, but there was no sign of an oil spill in the sea. Diesel fuel evaporates quickly. The oil rig was essentially intact, but the horizontal pontoon containing diesel fuels was stuck on the rocks. There was only one way of getting it off: to refloat it using the highest tide, called a leap tide, which occurs once every month. And the weather had to be good.
We looked at the, obviously the opportunities with the high waters, but it was really down to the Salvage Master and Transocean to decide when they would be ready and when there was the opportunity of the greatest success. What we didn't want to do was try and do the operation prematurely before we were ready, to compromise the rig even further and cause more damage, because with the incoming weather of that, there was a danger if we didn't get her out, when we were ready on our agenda. The longer she sat there, we knew she was likely to sustain more damage.
The tools that Smit needed to carry out the plan were transported to the remote island of Lewis. Smit's own tugs, the Union Bear, Union Princess, and the Olympic Orion, were brought in support. An Augusta Westland 139 helicopter was flown from the Pyrenees with a Catalan crew. Salvage personnel from Transocean joined Smit and Coast Guard crews on board. Despite the cold and bad weather, the salvors were able to get the generator working, and with it the 3 cranes on board, as well as essential lighting, heating and utilities, while the helicopter from the Pyrenees kept them supplied with what they needed. Hugh Shaw coordinated a committee of key players based in the town of Stornoway, the tiny capital of the island.
I established what we call a salvage control unit in Stornoway itself. I was meeting the key parties, the salvors, Transocean, the environmentalists, the Coast Guard on a daily basis to discuss the plans. Smit put forward a plan for refloating the installation itself, but there were a number of things that had to be completed before doing that. Obviously with the badly damaged tanks, they needed to put compressors on board to build up air pressure in the tanks to give the required amount of buoyancy for the refloat operation.
The rig is equipped with 4 diesel engines and thrusters, but since these were to be of little use in the refloat, salvors decided to remove all the fuel.
One of the other requirements we had was that we needed to remove, we still had 2 intact oil tanks down in the pontoon, and it was felt that the oil was very vulnerable, that should these tanks be ruptured during the refloat, then we could potentially lose over another 100 tonnes of diesel oil. So the decision was made that where it was safe to do so was to pump this oil from the 2 intact tanks, to dump the hydrocarbons up to a higher position in the rig using the rig's equipment itself. Having done that successfully, we then made a decision that before the refloat itself, we asked for that product to be removed from the rig.
Other vessels were deployed too. Oil spillage was a real threat during all the operations, so 2 crane barges, equipped with floating barriers, were close at hand. They were kept in the Bay of Carloway, where a small jetty allowed crews to land safely. As the days passed, the plan for refloating the rig came together, as local residents and journalists watched with a mix of concern and curiosity. There were 16 fuel tanks that could be emptied and filled with compressed air, and everything would depend on the tide. The tides of the Atlantic Ocean can be very high, and leap tides occur every month with the full moon. The full moon of August rose on the 18th, but the salvors were still not ready. There was a lot to be done yet, priority being given to sealing any fuel leaks. The local Callaway community began to grow anxious. The Coast Guard organized its meeting on the 18th, and this time delivered some answers to the worried Callaway citizens.
We got a huge amount of information. It was a very impressive presentation, and we're grateful that they came and did it. It really helped this community.
So it wasn't a matter of waiting for the first opportunity, it was making sure that all the work was completed up until that stage. And it was as we were nearing that that I was approached by the Salvage Master, and Transocean, and they set the date, and I gave my approval that if everything was in place by that time, I gave my consent for the operation to work towards that.
The plan, actually, we started with the assessment. The assessment is always ongoing because you never know if the condition of the rig will change. At the moment we are looking at pressurizing compartments of the rig in order to refloat the rig. In order to do so, we have a lot of equipment coming. There is still a critical part ahead of us, and we need to perform a lot of checks before we can say when we will do the actual refloating, but the method will be based on pressurization of compartments.
With the full moon now starting to wane, the high tides were getting lower and lower. The salvors would have to move fast, but the calculations provided by the marine architects were comforting. The need was to use every possible compartment in the rig to provide buoyancy, which meant not only offloading the diesel oil left on board, but attempting as much as possible to seal the breached tanks. The question would be relatively simple. Would the extra buoyancy be enough to raise the rig those 3 meters to get her unhooked? There were those in Callaway who had their doubts.
I'm not the marine expert on high tides, but I'm a leisure fisherman. There is a high tide this weekend. If they don't grab it, if they're not ready to grab it, then they will have to wait quite some time for another one. And there will not be another one, I don't think, for another month at least.
Well, the plan is we made a decision this morning at the meeting I had with Transocean and Smit Salvage that I've approved the go-ahead for a refloat tomorrow night on the high water. So yesterday they started with the compressors, trying to press up the tanks. That work continues today. So if all goes well, we'll be in a good position to know tonight if all of the 16 tanks that are required by the naval architects are going to hold the pressure we required for the refloat operation itself.
The tide of Monday would be sufficiently above the average sea level, and they needed to raise the horizontal pontoon over the rock. The rest of the rig would have to be able to float away too. Hugh Shaw was overseeing the decisions, and ultimate responsibility lay with him, as the UK government's representative.
We're hopeful that with the buoyancy, it will be sufficient to lift it above any obstructions, and she will float free from where she's sitting at the moment.
The Union Bear was called in to deliver 7 powerful compressors to the rig that would be used to pump air into the fuel tanks. Loading the compressors was a laborious task, given the angle the rig rested at and the positioning of the cranes.
And it was extremely difficult to really seal any of the chambers itself. There were some parts that it wasn't safe to put divers, in the water to go near. So there was some ROV footage, taken to try and give the Salvage Master a better understanding of what damage was there. So there was no real sealing done as such, but there was a number of flanges had to be fabricated on the island, you know, for connection of the air hoses from the compressors, and we used about 7 compressors.
The diesel oil also had to be removed, so the Olympic Princess was called in to take it aboard. The two ships could not operate together, so the debunkering could only happen once the compressors had been delivered. In the world of ship salvage, every operation has to happen in a synchronized order. A single mistake in the order of operations can disrupt and delay a salvage for weeks. In the meantime, the helicopter crew took Sylvia on patrols up and down the shoreline to check for oil slicks. Her worst nightmare, given the absolutely pristine nature of the shoreline. The last sufficiently high tide of the month was on the 22nd of August at 9 p.m, just 2 weeks after the Transocean winner ran aground. The day before, however, a dense fog enveloped the rig and the coastline. These extreme maritime conditions occur unexpectedly on the coast of the Outer Hebrides. The fog kept the helicopter grounded. How much would this poor weather delay operations? The island's marine architects, the Coast Guard, Hugh Shaw, and the salver Sylvia Torvet all gathered at the Coast Guard headquarters in Stornoway. Everyone had agreed on a plan. But would it work? The conditions for a safe refloat would be at least 16 airtight tanks would have to be filled with compressed air and sealed, and all heavy equipment taken off the rig. The weather would have to be clear and the sea calm. The rig would have to rise the 3 meters needed to unhook it from the rock, and 2 tugs would have to tow it away. Then the tugs and rig would have to make it all the way round the butt of Lewis, a particularly dangerous stretch of water, round the island. All this would have to happen during the darkness of night. Work carried on intensely on the 21st and well into the afternoon of the 22nd.
I think the risks, obviously, if she is impaled there and if she is holding, but we're not going to compromise what we've done up to this time. So, you know, we are going to see after tomorrow night a slight reduction in the high water heights. We still, Salvage Masters advise me, there still may be 2 opportunities to do it on this current cycle. But if not, we've removed much of the threat from the diesel oil. Yesterday we transferred 200 tonnes from the installation onto one of the supply vessels. So the risk itself environmentally over the last 24 hours has reduced considerably. There are only small quantities left on board now.
The 2 tugboats owned by Smit Boskalis were the Union Bear, 73.5 metres long, 16.5 metres wide, with a draft of 6.9 metres and a pulling power of 187 tons, and the slightly smaller Union Princess. The Union Bear is seen here on the day before the refloat in the port of Stornoway.
The 2 vessels that were engaged in the refloat was the Union Princess and the Union Bear, and they both made the connections during that day in the lead up to the refloat itself, and they were the 2 vessels that towed the rig round to Broad Bay itself.
In these images, shot during the night, the lights of the tugs and of the Transocean winner show the movements. The sea was calm. The spectators on shore were given hospitality and refreshments as the work on board continued frantically.
There was a lot of uncertainties. You know, there were parts of the rig certainly below the waterline that had been difficult to survey. So although the salvers had a fair understanding of what damage there was and what buoyancy there was always the danger that perhaps part of the pontoon might be impaled by one of the rocky outcrops. And although they may have had to their buoyancy, there was no guarantee that the rig would float off itself. So having stood for several hours on the beach with a large number of salvors and other staff and members of the public, there was delight to see the rig, starting to move itself into deeper water, as the tug started to pull her, off the beach.
The tide began rising, and the salvors watched impatiently. A small sea swell would also help raise the rig.
I think there was the concern that she may just simply swivel if she was stuck on the rocks itself, on that side. So again, we probably passed the high water time, and it was actually after that when we started to see the movement, and probably again minutes after that when we realised that she was finally clear of the rocky outcrop itself.
Copy that. The bracing has cleared the rock. Union Princess, Union Beer. Yeah, we can reduce the tension on the wire. Reduce some tension on the wire.
Great delight, and what we did hear in the background was a round of applause from many of there were hundreds of onlookers there, many members of the public, which I think was quite special moment in particular for the Salvage Master and her team, who'd done such a fantastic job in managing to get her out from there.
The plan had worked, and now the Transocean winner was afloat in deeper water.
We got the rig into deeper water. There was a period where the Salvage Master simply held the rig in that position. There was a need for the people on board. We had salvors on board, plus we had representatives from Transocean on board, and I think their role was to go around to check the spaces, to make sure she wasn't taking water in any other areas that we weren't anticipating, and again just trying to ensure that she was as stable as she could be before that tow commenced up and around the Butt of Lewis itself.
Now that the rig was off the rocks, getting it around the island before the weather turned was the salvors' main priority. The Transocean winner was off the rocks, but the 9 p.m. high tide had meant that the transfer around the Butt of Lewis had to be carried out at night. This was a particularly dangerous moment for the whole operation.
There was still some concern that, having successfully refloated the rig, we still had a tow which was going to be 53 miles. We'd estimated that tow may take about 18 hours to get the rig from the west of the island down to Broad Bay on the east side, and actually that took nearly 40 hours at the end of the day. So we knew that was still going to be a precarious part of the operation. That would be the first time that the naval architect and the salvors would be able to perhaps better understand what damage was, and knowing that the rig was simply going to be getting kept afloat by the compressors.
Once the rig was in the bay off Stornoway, it could be repaired and a plan for removing it could be made. The decision was reached to hire an amazing vessel to take the rig away. The OHT Hawk is a semi-submersible ship. It can be sunk and then refloated with cargo aboard. When the ship recovers buoyancy, it takes the load into the deck and can sail away.
To submerge the vessel, what we do first is to start filling up the tanks until the main deck is almost underwater. And this is a very critical stage, because if you have free water running around in the tanks when you submerge, the vessel loses its stability, and that's very critical.
The Hawk is owned by the Norwegian company OHT that is specialized in hiring out ships for specific tasks.
The Hawk was originally built as an oil tanker, and in 2008-2009 we took her into a shipyard in China and converted her into the vessel that we see today. We removed a 60-meter section of the midship, and we took down the depth of the vessel from 26 meters down to the 13 meters that the vessel has today. She has a weight of 25,600 tons, but when she's sailing, she has 85,000 tons. And if she's submerging, the weight of the vessel is actually 130,000 tons.
But how does a semi-submersible ship actually work?
We have specially designed the ballast system to make sure that we can fill the tank up to only a very few centimeters of air pockets in the tanks. And only when all this is under control, the crew on board will fill the rest of the tanks so that that the deck submerges underwater. And in this phase, we can go down in only a few hours, 2-3 hours, from deck just above water until the loading draft, when we can take the rig over the deck.
What are the special complications in loading it?
There are many things to take good care of when you want to submerge the vessel. One thing is free surfaces, as we call it, water being able to flow from one side to the other inside the tanks. The vessel has 78 ballast tanks, and there can be a lot of water flowing around. And that's very important for the crew to manage and to make sure that the tank is either completely full or completely empty. And we have designed the systems to make that job easy.
It arrived on the 21st of September 2016, 6 weeks after the rig was rammed ashore. The weather was changing fast, with autumn turning towards the dark northern winter. The oil rig's high profile made it unstable once the anchors had been released.
The waves are also important. We have a very low wave limit for these loading operations, because you have two floating objects. One is the ship that floats and heaves up and down with a certain frequency, and then you have the cargo with another frequency floating up and down. And when these come close to each other, they can hit each other, and you can have big damage both to the cargo and to the ship.
It would take another 2 weeks before a window of fine weather allowed the tugs to tow the rig over the sunken deck of the Hawk.
When we load a cargo like the Transocean Winner, she's brought across to the submerged vessel by tugs. So the rig has one tug connected in each corner, comes near the vessel, and then we use our workboat to run lines across to the rig. From there, we start pulling in, and the tugs give slack. And when we have full control of the cargo, when she's over our deck, then we start pulling her up against 2 9-meter tall guideposts.
Once the massive and severely damaged orange rig was precisely positioned over the deck of the Hawk, the reballasting could begin.
We have planned carefully in advance where these guideposts are going to hit the cargo, and we do that very slowly, so there's very little force going into them. It's a very controlled operation. So we pull the cargo onto the guideposts and see that the lines align with the center of the guidepost, and then we give the order to the chief officer to start deballasting the vessel. And we deballast until we have full contact with the vessel and see that everything is in order.
The Maritime Coast Guard Agency and Hugh Shaw could breathe a sigh of relief. The role of the UK's Coast Guard in this incident was exemplary.
I think the MCA, Maritime Coast Guard Agency, has got an extensive role right through the incident. For myself, they provided the facility, you know, and the infrastructure to support the salvage control unit that I chair with the other key stakeholders. They provide the communications through the Coast Guard side of the business, you know, out to all the vessels involved in the operation. They were responsible, the counter pollution and salvage, branch within the business. They were responsible for approving the oil spill contingency plans, that should we be unlucky enough to have a spill, then they could ensure that the plan was appropriate and the right equipment was there to deal with it. They were bringing in the aerial surveillance aircraft.
Finally, on the 12th of October 2016, the Hawk lifted the Transocean Winner out of the sea. The rig began its final voyage to Malta for demolition, one last adventure in its long life drilling for black gold. The island of Lewis could return to its tranquil, wild state. But questions remain about government cuts that removed the Coast Guard tugboat from Stornoway, leaving the island without an emergency response capacity.
But I think it would be fair to say that once the towing line had disconnected, it would have been extremely difficult. Obviously, the Alp Forward itself, the towing vessel, had tried to establish a reconnection. With the rig being unmanned itself, it would have been extremely difficult for any vessel or any number of vessels, had they been there, to effect another connection. So I don't think the fact that there was no tug there had any impact on this incident itself.
The Transocean Winner incident is an example of the kind of accident that could happen in the wild North Atlantic as cargo ships sail by these beautiful islands whose residents live peacefully off the land and the sea, unaware of the potential threat that plows the waves just a few miles westwards. However, the swift removal of the Transocean Winner from the rocks of Dalmore Beach is also the result of efficient salvage operations, closely monitored by Britain's authorities on one of its most remote shores.